trajectory offers a clear illustration of the challenges faced by established companies in managing technological shifts. On January 19, 2012, in Rochester, New York, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The organization that had dominated photography for over a century could no longer sustain its operations in their prior form. This outcome stands in direct contrast to an earlier internal development. In 1975, Kodak engineer Steve Sasson presented the company's own prototype for the first digital camera. The device captured images electronically and displayed them on a television screen. Executives characterized the work as a limited experiment and directed that it remain internal. The case is not one of technological oversight. It demonstrates how organizational power structures, the timing of strategic responses, executive priorities, and the psychological effects of sustained dominance can shape outcomes. Kodak held approximately 90% of U.S. film sales. In successive decisions, the company chose to protect existing profit margins rather than commit fully to emerging alternatives. The decline was therefore not inevitable, but the cumulative result of deliberate choices made over time. These choices positioned the company so that it could no longer support its own operations. The sequence reveals how market leadership can generate internal conditions that favor preservation of the current model, even when data indicate the need for earlier and more decisive adaptation. This pattern appears across industries when high-margin businesses confront structural change. What strategic choice would your organization make in the same position? Kodak's origins are rooted in Rochester in 1878. George Eastman, a 24-year bank clerk, identified the practical barriers in photography, which required glass plates, wet chemicals, darkrooms, and considerable equipment. To simplify the process for personal use, he conducted experiments with gelatin emulsions in his mother's kitchen at night. By 1879, Eastman had patented a dry plate coating machine. In 1881, he formed the Eastman Dry Plate Company with investor Henry Strong. 3 years later, the company introduced roll film, which offered a flexible and lightweight format that replaced earlier rigid methods. In 1888, the Kodak camera entered the market. It came preloaded with 100 exposures and operated on a complete service model. Customers pressed the button, returned the camera, and received developed prints along with a reloaded device. This approach eliminated technical complexity for the user and expanded photography beyond specialist practitioners to a mass market. Eastman chose the name Kodak for its distinctive sound and universal pronounceability. He established manufacturing operations that ran continuously. Within a decade, the company secured leading positions in film production, camera design, and processing services. Rochester expanded economically around the growing enterprise. Eastman's approach combined technical innovation with strict operational discipline and centralized control. He allocated substantial resources to philanthropy while maintaining exacting standards for execution. These characteristics formed the foundational culture of the company, a fusion of inventive capability and precise operational management. The model made complex processes invisible to customers, which drove widespread adoption and rapid market penetration. This founding framework delivered early advantages through efficiency and scale. Yet the same emphasis on disciplined execution and control later contributed to reduced adaptability when external technologies challenged the core product. The culture that enabled initial dominance carried an inherent risk of rigidity as conditions evolved. Throughout the 20th century, Kodak consolidated its position in photography. Roll film progressed to color formats. The Brownie camera was priced at $1, and the Instamatic, introduced in 1963, achieved sales of 50 million units. By 1976, the company controlled 90% of U.S. film sales and 85% of camera sales. Global film market share approached 50%, with film margins reaching 70 to 80%. At its peak, the company employed 145,000 people in Rochester. Kodak supported local hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions. The phrase Kodak moment entered everyday language. As a reference to any memory considered worth preserving, strategic execution reinforced. The position through full vertical integration, the company produced film, paper, chemicals, cameras, and operated processing laboratories. Competitors were either acquired or marginalized. Patents covered core technologies, and research facilities operated at a scale comparable to national laboratories. Market dominance translated into a cultural monopoly. Major life events and leisure activities relied on Kodak chemistry for image capture and preservation. The timing aligned with post-war economic growth and rising middle-class leisure spending. Kodak, therefore, sold more than film. It supplied the physical medium through which nostalgia was created and stored. Hardware margins remained thin, while consumable profits stayed high. Internally, the culture emphasized relentless execution. Technical staff were trained primarily as chemists. Film chemistry represented the central focus of operations. Any proposal that appeared to threaten the existing chemistry-based model encountered internal resistance. This orientation measured success through improvements in silver halide performance. The combination of vertical control, patent protection, and aligned incentives produced sustained profitability. Growth was achieved by expanding the installed base of cameras and then capturing repeat revenue from film and processing. Market dynamics favored the company because consumer behavior remained tied to physical prints during periods of prosperity. The structure allowed Kodak to dictate standards and pricing across the value chain. Yet the same architecture that supported expansion also embedded a focus on film as the defining product. When electronic alternatives later emerged, the established metrics of success and the cultural emphasis on chemistry limited the organization's responsiveness. The rise therefore contained the seeds of later constraints through the very mechanisms that generated dominance. By the mid-1990s, Kodak reached its highest level of market influence. Market capitalization exceeded $28 billion. Wall Street viewed the company as a reliable generator of cash flow. Executive compensation and operational scale reflected this status. The brand functioned as a cultural standard. Kodak was synonymous with photography, in the same way certain names define other consumer categories. Distribution networks, processing infrastructure, and consumer confidence remained unmatched by any competitor. Digital imaging technology existed in laboratory settings. Yet film sales continued to increase. Leadership referenced consumer preference data showing demand for physical prints. Digital products were regarded as niche items suited primarily to technical enthusiasts. The internal organization operated with a clear hierarchy. The film division exercised primary influence over strategy and resource allocation. Digital initiatives received funding only when they complemented rather than replaced film revenue streams. Questioning the centrality of film was interpreted as a challenge to the company's established identity. This configuration produced short-term stability. High margins and established processes reinforced confidence in the current model. The power structure ensured that decisions remained aligned with historical sources of profit. The result was a period of apparent invulnerability. Brand strength and operational integration created barriers to entry for others. However, the same factors that sustained peak performance also filtered information and incentives through the lens of the existing business. Forecasts and investment criteria were shaped by prior success, which reduced urgency around emerging shifts. The organization appeared unbeatable precisely because its internal systems were optimized for the conditions that had produced past results. In 1975, Steve Sasson, a 24-year-old electrical engineer at Kodak, assembled the first functional digital camera prototype. The device recorded an image of a lab technician and displayed it on a television screen after 23 seconds when the prototype was presented to executives. The reception was one of polite disinterest. One executive questioned the value of viewing images on a television rather than as prints. Another expressed concern that the project could affect film sales. The work was directed to remain internal. During the early 1980s, internal researchers documented advances in digital sensors. Studies prepared for the board projected that film demand could decline substantially within 10 to 15 years. Management acknowledged the reports but allocated additional resources primarily to film research and development. External competitors, including Sony and Canon, began to explore digital options. Kodak responded with defensive patent strategies and limited hybrid offerings. The threat remained effectively invisible not because information was absent, but because acknowledging its full implications required acceptance that the core business model faced fundamental limits. Organizational psychology played a central role. Leadership had built its identity around film chemistry and associated margins. Any shift that threatened those foundations encountered resistance at multiple levels. The result was a pattern of minimal engagement rather than proactive repositioning. Timing compounded the effect. Early recognition existed, yet the response remained calibrated to protect rather than replace the dominant revenue stream. The organization, therefore, operated with partial visibility into the change underway, which delayed more comprehensive strategic adjustments. This dynamic illustrates how internal frameworks can render external developments less salient even when data are generated internally. Leadership succession remained concentrated among executives with deep experience in film operations. In 1993, George Fisher became the first outsider appointed as CEO. He initiated the sale of non-core businesses and directed significant investment toward digital capabilities. However, the board and middle management continued to prioritize the established film model. Digital units operated under tight constraints and were not permitted to reduce film revenue. Executives who advocated more aggressive digital strategies faced marginalization or departure. The company's incentive systems reinforced this orientation. Compensation, promotion, and performance metrics remained tied to film sales volumes and associated margins. Cultural norms continued to celebrate achievements. Linked to traditional chemistry, by the late 1990s, film sales reached a peak and then stabilized. Internal forecasts indicated accelerating decline ahead. Management responded by intensifying efforts on incremental improvements to film products and manufacturing processes. The underlying issues were not technical in nature. They stemmed from organizational psychology and incentive design. A culture accustomed to 70–80% margins found it difficult to accept business models that might operate at substantially lower levels, even when survival required the transition. Strategic planning, therefore, favored short-term protection of the cash-generating core over rapid self-displacement. Resources flowed toward optimizing the existing system rather than building independent digital capabilities at scale. The cracks appeared gradually through misaligned priorities rather than sudden external shocks. This phase demonstrates how entrenched structures can limit the execution of stated strategic intentions. Even when leadership recognized the need for change, the combination of cultural loyalty, incentive alignment, and hierarchical power distribution slowed the pace of adaptation. The result was a widening gap between market evolution and organizational response. In 1996, Kodak introduced the Advanix Preview System, a hybrid film and digital product that received an investment of $500 million. Market response remained focused on the film component, and the digital preview feature functioned primarily as an added element rather than a core shift. The launch signaled continued commitment to protecting film revenue. Substantial capital was allocated to digital camera development. However, pricing remained elevated, and marketing emphasized compatibility with existing film workflow. Sony and Canon, meanwhile, introduced affordable point-and-shoot digital models that gained rapid consumer acceptance. In 2001, Kodak acquired Ofto, an early online photo-sharing platform. The service was configured to encourage additional film printing rather than to establish an independent digital ecosystem. The asset was later divested at a modest valuation, shortly before similar platforms achieved large-scale adoption. Under CEO Antonio Perez, appointed in 2005, the company accelerated efforts in digital printing and related services. By this stage, the dedicated camera market had begun to commoditize, and smartphone integration was emerging. Kodak achieved temporary leadership in digital camera unit sales, yet low margins and intense price competition resulted in ongoing cash consumption. Additional decisions compounded the position. Digital technologies were licensed to other firms. Rather than used to control an integrated ecosystem, the potential impact of smartphone cameras on the overall imaging market received limited strategic emphasis. Executive confidence rested on the belief that prior invention of digital technology conferred lasting control. Later responses included large-scale restructuring, workforce reductions, and asset sales. Each step signaled reduced capacity and accelerated the loss of market confidence. The pattern reflected an inability to accept that the period of film-based supremacy had concluded. Investments continued to favor nostalgia-driven segments, while consumer behavior shifted toward instant, shareable, and low-cost digital capture. The sequence of actions illustrates the consequences of timing and prioritization. Defensive and incremental adjustments preserved short-term revenue at the expense of building durable positions in the new environment. Organizational ego, incentive structures, and cultural attachment to historical success limited the scope of change. These choices, though rational within the existing framework, produced cumulative effects that eroded competitive standing. Market dynamics moved faster than internal decision processes could accommodate. Between 2000 and 2010, film sales declined by half and then halved again. The dedicated digital camera segment commoditized rapidly. The introduction of smartphone cameras eliminated the need for separate devices in most consumer applications. Kodak's stock price fell from approximately $70 to pennies per share. Rochester experienced significant contraction. Manufacturing facilities closed and employment levels dropped by roughly 50,000 positions within a decade. The organization that had once supplied the primary medium for preserving personal and cultural records could no longer generate sufficient revenue to cover its obligations. In January 2012, Chapter 11 proceedings commenced. Creditors assumed control of key assets. Patents that had represented substantial value were sold in distressed transactions. The leadership group that had directed a global enterprise now oversaw the orderly disposition of remaining holdings. Production of major film lines ceased without formal ceremony. Operations wound down as market demand continued to contract. The company that had built its position on the permanence of chemical images reached a point where it could not maintain its own continuity. The collapse occurred through a self-reinforcing cycle. Reduced film revenue led to lower investment capacity, which further weakened competitive offerings in digital spaces. Consumer migration to smartphone solutions removed the remaining addressable market for traditional cameras. Financial pressure mounted as legacy costs, including pension obligations, remained elevated relative to shrinking income. This phase demonstrates how delayed adaptation creates accelerating negative momentum. Once market share erosion began in earnest, the structural advantages that had supported dominance, vertical integration, brand strength, and distribution provided limited protection against a technology that bypassed the entire value chain. The outcome was the orderly unwinding of an enterprise whose core assumptions about consumer behavior and technology had been overtaken by external developments. Kodak emerged from bankruptcy proceedings in 2013 as a significantly smaller entity. Employment stood at approximately 4,000 positions. The company focused on specialty film, commercial printing, and advanced materials. An unexpected revival of analog film occurred. Among younger consumers and artists seeking characteristics associated with traditional capture, Kodak positioned itself to serve this niche demand. As of 2025, the company continues operations with annual revenue near $1 billion, compared with $16 billion at its historical peak. Debt levels have prompted refinancing discussions and pension adjustments aimed at stabilizing the balance sheet. The original Kodak Park complex in Rochester operates at a fraction of its former scale. The corporate name persists, yet the scale and scope of the original enterprise have contracted substantially. The organization now functions as a specialized participant in selected segments rather than as the dominant force in consumer imaging. This outcome reflects the long-term consequences of the strategic path chosen during the period of peak influence. The company retained certain technical capabilities and brand equity, but lost the broad market position that had defined it for more than a century. Kodak's experience constitutes a documented instance of the innovator's dilemma. The failure did not result from ignorance of technological possibilities. It resulted from a series of rational, data-supported decisions that proved incompatible with long-term survival. Sustained high margins generated risk aversion. Organizational identity became closely linked to the dominant technology forecasts, and resource allocation remained anchored in historical incentives. These factors combined to delay and limit the scope of self-disruption. Several principles emerge from the case. A company should not allow its primary revenue source to constrain investment in replacement technologies. Self-disruption requires early and decisive action rather than incremental adjustments timed after market shifts have occurred. Organizations rarely fail because of absent vision. They fail because internal structures lack the mechanisms to act against established interests. Leadership that lacks vigilance toward its own assumptions risks strategic stagnation. Kodak did not lose to external technology in isolation. It lost through the gradual internal erosion of the capacity to prioritize future viability over current performance. The sequence underscores a recurring dynamic in competitive markets. Success creates the conditions that can undermine adaptability. Strategic thinkers may consider how their own organizations balance the protection of existing cash flows with the requirement to pursue potentially lower margin opportunities that define the next era. What decision frameworks would enable earlier and more effective transitions when similar signals appear in your industry?